Number 1. Homeless. This story happened during a more difficult time in my life. There was a period of time in my late 20s that I was homeless for a while. It wasn't in an urban area, though. It was outside of a small town in Tennessee. I had gotten into drinking a little bit too much and also doing some drugs a little too much. So although I was able to get little bits of money here and there from doing odd little jobs or begging, I normally would spend it getting wasted instead of trying to get a place to live. Plus, I had been kicked out of the motels in the area, which were mostly where the very poor people in that area lived. There was a wooded area right outside of town, but along one of the roads. That was an area that I stayed in. I lived for years in a tent, and although some other people would come and go with their own tents, I would occasionally meet someone, and they would stay with me for a while too. There was a bus stop in town where I guess sometimes people from out of town would get stuck in our area with nowhere to go. More than once, I let one of those people come and stay with me in my tent. And this is what happened on one of those times that I had done that. I had been hanging out in town at the convenience store that the bus stop was at. The cashiers would sometimes give the homeless people free fountain drink. It didn't seem to mind if we waited outside with a sign asking for spare change. That afternoon, there was a teenager boy who had gotten off the bus. He was having an argument with the bus driver as he got off. It seemed that he was begging to let the driver let him ride a little further on the bus. However, the driver wasn't going to let him. Apparently the kid only had enough money to get as far as our town. The kid, visibly upset, got off the bus, and then it pulled away, straining the kid in our little one-horse town. After walking around for a little while, not knowing where to go, he sat on the side of the parking lot, holding his head in his hands. After a bit, I went up to the kid. I found out that I was right about everything I assumed. He didn't know anyone in the state, much less the town. Plus, he had no money, and no way to get anywhere or anything. He had run away from home for reasons that I would find out later were abusive parents. This was going to be, however, his first full night without a roof over his head. So I offered to show him back to the area where my tent was, and told him he could sleep there if he wanted to. I was able to get the kid to calm down quite a bit, and even told him there were ways he could work and get some money if he wanted to move on to wherever he was headed. He had a lot to talk about, and since I spent all the time by myself, I was more than happy to listen to him too, so we stayed up pretty late. Around the time that I thought we should finally get some sleep, I noticed a light shining for a brief moment in the woods. I didn't know what it was, but I saw it about 2 times. There weren't any other guys staying out there at the time, so I didn't know who it could be. I knew the police wouldn't be coming out there either, but the light made me think there was definitely someone out there in the woods. I didn't want to worry the kid, so I didn't say anything about it at first. I mean, he had already gone through enough, but I kept an eye on the woods in case someone was out there. I couldn't for the life of me think of anyone who had any reason to be out there. I just decided to keep an eye on it, and if they got too close, I would take care of whatever was happening. But I didn't get the best chance to do that. I heard a few noises like someone walking around in the woods, but without seeing any more lights. Then seemingly out of nowhere, some huge guy came charging out of the woods from behind the kid and right at him. I reacted as quickly as I could, knocking the kid out of the way, but this got me stabbed in the shoulder. It wasn't the first time I'd ever been stabbed in my life, but it still hurt as bad as it ever did before. I told the kid to run toward the town where I'd met him, and he took off running pretty quickly. The guy left me there, and then ran after the kid. I got up in pain and figured I had better follow them. I was not the best runner with all my years of abuse issues, so I wasn't able to catch up with them. But I also knew I couldn't let the kid fend for himself. He was already scared from running away and being left in our town alone. Being chased by a maniac was just that much worse. However, they had both ran so fast that they had left me behind pretty quickly. I wondered why the guy had taken off after the kid and not attacked me more. It didn't take long for me to get winded, but I kept following the path that would take us back to the road and then back to the convenience store. It was a 24/7 convenience store, so we could get there to get away from the guy chasing him. I got out of the woods and onto the back road that I walked along to get to the store. There were some houses along that road, but it was late and all their lights were off. I went toward the store, my sides hurting because of how bad a shape I was in. I still didn't see anyone alongside the road. I made my way down the dark road, which came up behind the convenience store. There were many trees and bushes on both sides of the road, so I kept darting my eyes back and forth to see if anyone was hiding in them. I didn't know what I would have done if the man had hidden there, waiting to pounce again. So as I staggered toward the store, I was definitely expecting that to happen. I got to the convenience store, though, without a further incident. I didn't see anything at first. My mind told me that the man must have caught the kid and dragged him back into the woods. I was worried and about to turn around to go back, but then I noticed him inside the store, talking to one of the workers. I went in there to try and find out what happened. The man had chased the kid out of the woods, but then ran back into them, he told us, so the kid just continued back to the store. The man didn't want to follow him out of the woods, so the kid got to the store and they called the police. When the police came, he gave a description of the man, and the cops seemed to know immediately who it was. When the guy was arrested, we were able to identify him correctly. He had previously served time in jail for assaulting other homeless people in town years back. He hated homeless people, thinking that they were ruining his town. Number 2. The Wood. I have a friend of mine who went through this experience with me. Only the fact that we both still swear that we went through it makes sense to us. And that will make a lot more sense when the story is over. My friend Eddie and I grew up together going hiking. We hiked around all the time as kids, and continued doing it as adults too. As adults, though, there was a very specific area that we loved going out and exploring in. It was big and vast enough that we were always able to find something new every time we went out. This was on a fall day. We were both wearing jackets and hats because it was pretty cool outside. We had been out for a couple days, but it wasn't supposed to be a really long hiking trip, just a few days worth. So we were planning on heading back to civilization after this day. After lunchtime, the two of us had hiked a bit away from each other. I was sure that I knew where Eddie was at all the time, though. I could distinctively hear him in the woods most of the time, because I knew what a person going through the woods sounded like. So it was mildly shocking when he was able to sneak up on me from behind. He startled me out of my skin, but that was over quickly. He seemed to be pretty excited about something. He had found something he told me I would never believe unless I saw it for myself. I followed Eddie around to the side of this hill, and what he brought me to was very shocking. There was some sort of structure built into the side of the hill. It had a small entryway, but it was like a man-built entryway into the side of the hill. I'd come across structures in the woods before, but this was very different. "Let's go in and check it out," Eddie suggested. I wanted to wait to get you to check it out first. I wanted to protest. I had no idea what this was, but I knew how some people way out in the hills could be. Who knew if this wasn't the dwelling of some sort of man-hating hermit who would want to gut us. But Eddie was insistent. There were some branches in the way of the door, and we moved them out of the way, and we opened up the door and went in. So it was like some small bunker or something built into the hill. It looked like something someone would have built to survive after a nuclear explosion. That's the only way that I could ever think to describe it. And honestly, that in itself wouldn't have been too much of a surprise. It definitely wasn't surprising that things like this existed, especially knowing the kinds of people who avoid civilization. What was unnerving about it was the kind of stuff that we found in it. There were weapons that were definitely not old. There were all sorts of rifles and guns and such things that I really didn't know what they were. But what was scarier was there was a table with some writings on it. Eddie was looking through the stuff, saying it was all sorts of doomsday, end-of-the-world type writings. There was lots of anti-government stuff in there too. Now, I wasn't really worried too much about whoever kept that place overthrowing the government, but I was very worried about such a person catching us in his little bunker, and there was every indication that this was definitely not an abandoned place. So I was thankful when I finally was able to convince Eddie to leave the place. I was pretty worried on our way back. Eddie wasn't freaked out at all. He really thought the entire thing was pretty cool. But I remembered earlier thinking that I heard Eddie walking in the woods, when it was really someone else entirely. As we were hiking back, I kept hearing things too. I heard someone walking in the woods, like we were being followed. But Eddie just thought I was being paranoid and hearing things. We camped that night. It would be the last night that we did that before we got back to civilization. I was still deeply disturbed by what we had seen in that little bunker. And I was certain that someone was out there in the woods. Every little noise would make me nervous. It was hard getting to sleep, but I eventually did. The following morning, Eddie woke me up and told me to come out of my tent. I did, and I was pretty terrified about what I saw. 2 dolls were hanging from the branch of a tree. They were hanging by ropes around their necks. They were both male dolls, and they hadn't been there when we went to sleep. We took it as the warning that it probably was. Eddie finally believed, as I had, that it was a mistake to go into that bunker, and the best thing to do would be to get out of the woods as quickly as we could. It was a harrowing journey. I could have sworn we were still being followed. I was worried about every little noise I heard. I couldn't keep myself from being on edge the entire time. Well, obviously Eddie and I made it out of the woods fine. I mean, if we didn't, I wouldn't be able to tell you the story. But it was still the scariest encounter I'd ever had. Whoever had built that bunker, he knew we had been in it, and he was not happy about it. I think we were lucky that he only threatened us with the dolls. It could have been much worse. Number 3. The Storm Cellar. When we first moved from Jacksonville, Florida, with its white sandy beaches, marine fishing, alligators, white ibis, swamps, quicksand, coral reefs, moray eels, sea snakes, cottonmouth moccasins, spiders and centipedes as big as your hand, I was barely 4 years old. We left behind my maternal grandmother, Jeannie, our live-in housemaid, who was the mother and surrogate joy of my life, my Uncle Charlie, who was my maternal grandmother's second husband, my maternal aunts, Babs and Dee, my 2 favorite cousins, Gary and Ray. Frankie wasn't born yet, and a whole slew of other friends and relatives that I never had the chance to meet or ever get to know, and moved to a nondescript little farming community in central Iowa. It might as well have been the dark side of the moon. In Florida there were Caribbeans, Native Indians, Latinos, Asians, Europeans, sailors, merchant marines, fishermen, retirees, Southern Baptists, Pentecosts, Catholics, et al. With all the rich diversity, character, intelligence, and charm of a plurality of people from all over the planet and from all walks of life. In Iowa, they were of blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Germanic, Scandinavian, Irish, English, and Scottish ancestry who had for generations been melded in the religious traditions of Calvinism, Methodism, and Lutheranism, and whose life experiences were little more than farming, some military service, religion, and an agrarian lifestyle. The house we moved into was a 4-bedroom farmhouse built during the Depression. My mother and stepfather bought it on the VA home loan bill, and with 7 kids, and 1 more on the way, it was barely adequate for 6. The town's origin was reputed to be its founder, Thomas Mitchell, a farmer back in 1844, who, like those before him, answered the call to Horace Greeley's "Go west, young man." He carved out the first farm in what would later become Polk County, Iowa. When we first moved there in 1959, the population was about 957 souls. Jacksonville, Florida had a population of 372,000, of which 27% were black. Mitchellville had not one black person except for me. Because of my skin tone when we first moved there, dark brown, from playing on the beach and swimming in the surf all day, I was about the closest most of these folks had ever seen, and the local bad boys and bullies rarely missed the chance to call me the N-word when they weren't calling me something else. Because Jeannie, who we left back in Florida, was black, I took it as a badge of honor and grew up fighting a lot of kids and some adults over her and my mother, whose skin tone, hair, and eye color were the same as mine, but that's another story. One of the few good things about moving to the far side of the moon was the peach, apple, apricot, black walnut, and black and red raspberry bushes that grew on the property. Those and the 4 enormous 100-year-old Dutch elm trees, 2 in the front on each side of the property, like giant sentinels, and 2 at the back of the house. One right outside my mother and stepfather's bedroom, and the other right outside the dining room solarium. The 2 at the front towered over a street which, coincidentally, was called Elm Street, and the 2 at the back spread out over the entire house and into and over the Mrs. House next door. The dining room solarium was an addition built sometime in the 1950s that faced south. It had windows across its length, a hard-tiled floor, and was paneled in bird's eye, or what was locally called knotted pine, a type of yellow pine from central Canada. The shade from the trees provided shelter for hundreds of cicadas and other flying insects during the day, and thousands of teeming fireflies, or lightning bugs, at night, turning the hot and steamy summers of Iowa into a Midwest fairyland. And during the winter, when the storm window's on, and the single gas stove heater just below the kitchen window, the snow-reflected sunlight not only warmed the entire room, but brought in a winter wonderland-like aura to everything and everyone inside. The dining room solarium was, without a doubt, the best part of the house. Looking out directly south, between the multitude of windows and the large black walnut trees of the south lawn, was the storm cellar. It was one of those odd, grass-clad 1920s-style humps you'd see in people's yards while driving through the countryside on a Sunday morning after church. It was green like the yard around it, and was particularly daunting when mowing. If you couldn't push the mower up over the hill, you had to pull it backward, which meant watching behind you so you wouldn't trip and accidentally cut off the tops of both of your feet. Or so the cautionary tale went. At the top was a little chimney, what you'd have to keep from tripping over for ventilation. The only windows were in the entryway of a little add-on outbuilding that had a locked door that housed the concrete stairs that led down into the cellar. My mother used to store potatoes, yams, cukes, apples, turnips rutabaga, her gladiola bulbs, onions, the lawnmower, snow shovels, some yard tools and canned goods. It was always a bit foreboding due to all the spider webs, cobwebs, silverfish, bugs, granddaddy longlegs, black widows, and centipedes that called it home. And it was always adorned with the ghost-like exoskeletons of their victims that littered the ground. It had a dirt floor, and crisscrossed the entryway, which were forever still stuck in their webs, an embalmed testament to the insatiable voracity of the predator-prey relationship. Delicately placed all around the add-ons were pieces of coral, driftwood, seashells, and pure white silica sand my mother brought from Florida. What grew there was wild peppermint, wild spearmint, and massive clusters of rhubarb. On just about any hot, humid Iowa summer day, with the temperature at about 90 degrees, with 90% humidity, the fresh, red, taut, and crisp rhubarb stalks were a godsend, and with sugar to die for. We learned later in field biology that they were quite rich in vitamin C and antioxidants, and were a natural anti-carcinogen, and as infuriatingly predictable as the local inhabitants, Mitchellville did have its charm. Surrounded by thousands of acres of 6-foot-tall field corn, soybeans, and alfalfa fields, it was nonetheless an oasis for flora and fauna. It was the prairie after all, with prairie grass, butterfly milkweed, coneflowers, yarrow ironweed, black walnut, white oak, shagbark hickory, and sugar maple, intermixed with cattle, cows, pigs, geese, chickens, ducks, pigeons, pheasants, quails, horses, dogs, cats, coyotes, foxes, weasels, muskrats, timber rattlers, bull snakes, copperhead moccasins, snapper turtles, large and smallmouth bass, bluegill, sunfish, catfish, bullheads, and lots of others to pique the imagination of any healthy and curious boy or girl in their rampant explorations of life on planet Earth. Each of the other towns in the surrounding area were pretty much the same, and each, like Mitchellville, had its one schoolhouse, which educated all school-aged children from kindergarten to the 12th grade. Whether recess or lunch, the entire student body would turn out together. The town's siren, an equivalent to the church bell, would always go off at exactly noon for lunch, even on weekends, even when school was not in session, unless it was an emergency. When the klaxon went off that day, it wasn't noon. Naturally, everyone was a little confused at first, but as it continued to sound over and over for almost 10 minutes, we all became not a little frightened. My mother and our next-door neighbors were calling each other on the phone across their yards or up and down the street, yelling over the din, trying to figure out what was happening. When someone said that the 50,000-watt WHO TV-13 had announced a tornado warning, the town went immediately to work and started battening down the hatches. The difference was that back home, we'd get a few hours, or even days to get ready. It was a matter of minutes. Our neighbors were pulling their cars and boats into their garages and carports, securing their windows about 1 inch above the sill. The common wisdom of the times was to leave your windows cracked against implosion. Securing their animals, securing their children, and moving everybody and any perishables down into the basement to find a corner, depending on which way the storm was coming, that would act as a kind of two-sided shelter should the floor collapse. Either that or a bathtub if you didn't have a basement. In our family, my older brother and mother were doing all the heavy lifting. My stepfather was at work and wouldn't be home until after 6 p.m., getting all of us ready, and Mongo, my stray mutt, and Queenie, our stray cat, organized and ready to go. The wind was starting to go nuts, so after grabbing some blankets, towels, extra water, and lunch meat and bread from the refrigerator, we made our way, en masse, out to the storm shelter. Because the storm appeared at first to be coming out of the southwest, we momentarily took shelter outside the storm cellar. The entrance was on the lee side, or opposite side, of where the storm was coming, while my brother fumbled with the keys to the padlock. Once he got the door open, we were stopped in our tracks by all the spider webs, cobwebs, mold, and dirt, along the multitude of exsanguinated corpses, trembling in the breeze. No one had been down here in quite some time. After Mom gave me an adamant no, my brother agreed, and the rest of us gave out a sigh of relief. Our relief was short, however, when a lightning bolt struck not 50 feet from the house. It was so loud and of such force, it shook the ground and broke one of the dining room solarium windows. With the air now charged with electricity and smelling of ozone, whipping itself into a gale-force wind, another long protracted lightning strike struck somewhere above our heads. In the torrent that followed, I could just make out my mother's face wincing from the pelting rain and hail. Her mouth contorted. I couldn't tell if it was water or tears running down her face, but with my eldest brother leading the entire brood. She kept acting like she was trying to say something, but I couldn't hear what it was. None of us could. Only the sudden bam on the ground from like a giant's foot. I wouldn't find out until later what that was. Shuttling us across the yard and up the steps and into the backdoor dining room solarium entrance with one large black umbrella, we were ushered instantly through the kitchen, down the stairs, and into the dark, dank confines of the basement. Fortunately, the spiderwebs and cobwebs didn't look as forbidding as they did on the stairs leading down to the storm shelter. Without a second thought, my elder brother bravely went back up for Mongo and Queenie. He was my hero. Once he returned, we all clung together with our blankets and towels, passing the water jar between us. Nobody was hungry for bologna sandwiches, so we all just trembled there in the dark, listening to the freight train over our heads, sounding like it was running full speed through the house and around the yard. I still remember that at the moment. It wasn't so much how it all sounded or looked. We couldn't see much of anything anyway down in the basement, as how it felt when my brother suddenly stopped and stood halfway up, wide-eyed, and with a completely blank look on his face, as though he was listening intently for something. Then everything went completely silent. For some seconds it was like we'd all gone deaf. I could even feel the pressure in my ears, like when you're deep underwater and you had to swallow to pop them back out. After that, what had been total darkness was now a faint light gradually getting brighter, just outside, and through the east window well. The color of the light was weird, because it looked like distorted or refracted light shining through a dirty aquarium. It had a kind of green tint, interspersed with yellow and brown, gradually turning black. At first we took it for the sun, but it wasn't like any sunlight we'd ever seen before. The strange color of the light and the dark, mildewy smell inside the basement made us all feel sick, my younger brother especially. He kept saying he thought he was going to throw up. My mom told him and all of us just to close our eyes. It worked. After we opened them again, the light was gone, and once again we were encased in total darkness. If it hadn't been for my brother bringing the flashlight, we would all have just about lost it. When my mother took the flashlight from my brother, she shone it on each of us, and I could see in turn the expressions on everybody's faces. It was like the night terrors I'd had almost every night since leaving Florida. The fear, the shock, the disbelief just before. I started to fidget uncomfortably at the thought of what might happen to those that I still had left, and what I would do if I lost them. When the wind started back up with the freight train and the lightning strikes, I closed my eyes and clung to anyone that was close. We all did. Between the momentary breaks of lightning and thunder, I could hear my mother and siblings cry and whisper and ask God to help us. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke, the storm had moved further north, and everybody acted like they had slept too, though fitfully. Slowly we stirred, whispering as if someone might hear, and it was only after all of us were fully awake and hungry now that my brother suddenly realized that he'd forgotten something. The wind was still screaming around out there, like it was still searching for something, with the rain and the receding thunder, when we all began to sniff at the smell of something burning. When Mom started to move, my brother busted out laughing. We didn't know that what we were smelling wasn't the house on fire. It was... "The pies, Mom! I forgot the pies!" We all busted out after that, even my younger brother Rick. When my hero started to get up, Mother clung on to him a second longer and said with all the melodrama she could muster, "Please, Bob, be careful. Save the pies." When he got back, the edges of the peach were singed, but the apple, my favorite, was almost perfect. Who was it that said, "Food never tastes as sweet as when it's snatched from the jaws of adversity"? When we rose up, out of the ashes as it were, from one of the closest encounters to a tornado any of us had ever had or ever would again, we went directly through the kitchen to the front room, out the front door, and into the front yard to behold a war zone. Trees were split or uprooted altogether. Tree limbs were everywhere, some of them quite large. Litter was everywhere. Directly across the street was Anthony's house, with a huge front porch, and its large porch swing. It had been crushed by the massive Dutch elm that had been growing in their front yard for over 100 years. It was one of the largest Dutch elms in the town. Almost the house had been reduced to splintered wood. Across from the Anthonys was the Van de Haars. Another part of one of Anthony's huge trees fell on their carport, effectively destroying old man Van de Haar's boat. It was a total loss. They'd never spoken much before. I don't think they ever spoke again. Looking down the block, it looked like many other houses had met the same fate. Though after the sound and the fury, miraculously, there were no casualties. Well, not directly, anyway. Old man Anthony died of a heart attack 3 months later. I remember standing in the front yard, taking in all the carnage and wondering about the old red stone brick schoolhouse with the spooky fire escape, or the old Jacobean-style congregational church with decades of wild bee honeycombs undermining the entire north side of the church. What was uptown with the Sinclair gas station on the corner and Hayes variety store across the street? The old hotel had burned down the year before, so it wouldn't have been the worst. There was nothing there now but an empty lot. What about the farmer's saving bank that had already been robbed once, and would go on to be robbed 2 more times? Or the old post office where the town sheriff used to park and sleep in his car at night? Standing in the middle of our debris-strewn front yard, at the vast old age of 9 years, I pondered these age-old questions while looking northwest in the direction the storm had gone, and I remembered what I had imagined in the basement earlier that morning, an enraged and wounded animal. When I finally managed to pull myself away and look at each of my brothers and sisters, especially my mother, I could see it's taken its toll. I remember feeling a mixture of pity, sympathy, and relief at the damage to our neighbors' houses and yards, compared to ours, which was, at that time, mostly intact, until my mother called all of us to the backyard. When I finally got around the piles of fallen trees and branches, I remember my eldest sister's gasp and the shock on my younger brother's face when we all realized what could have happened. The huge Dutch elm that grew on the southeast corner of the dining room solarium had split in 2, and one whole half of that tree had fallen on the outbuilding and directly onto the storm cellar, leaving it. I thought of the giant's foot, a wounded and enraged animal. It was a good thing my elder brother, Bob, my hero, hadn't swept out the storm cellar last week when my mother asked. Over the ensuing weeks, the town cleaned up and began rebuilding their homes and their lives. My mother and I, and my next eldest sister, cleared away the wood and debris from what was left of the outbuilding, and collected all the fired red brick, coral, driftwood, and seashells, and as much of the white silica sand we could salvage, and made a red brick patio. around the 3 black walnut trees in the backyard. As for the magnificent Dutch elms that were the pride of the town, an accidentally imported fungus spread by the common bark beetle decimated the North American and European elm population. All of them had to be cut down and burned to prevent the spread to other trees. The town was never the same after that.
Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.